Hello, everyone, and welcome to MTNmeister. I am your host, Ben Shank. On January 31st, the American Alpine Club had their annual benefit dinner. This is their biggest event and one of the most anticipated throughout the year. This time, the gathering was in New York City, and climbing legends from all over the country and even the world were in attendance. During the day, the club hosted an interview, a panel discussion, and a presentation. This is the panel discussion. It's an Everest panel full of notable guides and Sherpas. For those of you who are loyal listeners to MTNmeister, you'll recognize some of the names from past guests that we've had on the show. If you'd like to hear the other two discussions that happened on this day, you can find both of them on our website, MTN, like the abbreviation for Mountain, Meister, MEISTER.com, or you can find us on iTunes and any other podcast platform. Just type in MTNmeister, all one word, into the search box.
Who are the MTNmeisters?
Committing to the goal and galvanizing you and your team behind that one single focus.
Being at peace with that fear and being okay with it.
You gain a real appreciation for your life and for what you have.
Learn about their extreme lives on rock, snow, and ice with your host, Ben Shank.
Let me start by asking the room, how many people in this room have stood atop Mount Everest? 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Well, that's a pretty good crowd. I counted 10 or 12. Plus this crowd here. I think on the stage, including our moderator, we have 45 summits sitting before you. I'm happy to welcome this crowd. We ended the last discussion alluding to what's going on Mount Everest, the future it faces, the past it has experienced, and the issues that are to come. So today, to talk about all that, I've got Ngima Sherpa from Nepal. Greg Vernovage, did I pronounce that right?
Works for me.
All right. Who's been managing the base camp there for years and years and years. Phunuru Sherpa, thank you for being here.
Thanks.
Garrett Madison, Madison Mountaineering. Melissa Arnot, who's climbed Everest how many times, Melissa?
5.
5 times. And Dave Hahn, who happens to triple that. And Alan Arnette, who reached the summit just here recently, is going to be our moderator for this evening, or this afternoon. And really what we're talking about is something that is new to us in the mountaineering community. The fact that things are changing in Nepal and on Mount Everest at a pace that's hard to keep up with. But these people know it better than I, and I'll turn it over to you, Alan. Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. So this is going to be a little bit different from a normal panel where you normally ask one question and just kind of go down the row and ask everybody to address it. Instead, I'm going to ask one person a question and then invite other people on the panel to make any comments that they like. And I've got 20 questions. So are you ready, panel?
Don't look at me.
Okay, the first question is, who's going to win the Super Bowl, Greg?
Seattle.
Oh, Seattle. All right, there you have it. All right, we're getting into the meat of it now. Mr. Hahn, for you, Dave. So, there's a lot of talk about climate change and how it's affecting the highest mountains all around the world, much less Everest. In fact, Sherpa is famous for saying that Everest is going to become unclimbable eventually due to climate change. So, you've been climbing. When was your first summit?
I first went in 1991
and first got to the top in 1994 on the north side.
Okay, so we're talking, close to 20 some odd years now.
I can no longer do the math.
So how has Everest changed in the time that you've seen it over a couple of decades relative to climate change?
Well, if you didn't know the greater framework, you wouldn't be able to say that you're not just seeing normal variation, but it so obviously fits in with what you read in the newspaper about what's going on. It's very clear when you look at the lower glaciers on the north side, the south side, they're going away. The down wasting of the glaciers that David Brashears and others have documented is staggering. And yes, you can very clearly see that with your own eyes, how the lower glaciers, the Rongbuk and the Khumbu, are now just a series of lakes and meltwater. As for the changes up higher, that's going to be tougher to tell because, of course, those colder regions will still be cold. But clearly, at least right now, we're in a drought on the upper mountain. It's been so dry in recent years that it was very interesting listening to Chris Bonington talking about the Hillary Step. He wouldn't recognize it right now. It's so dry compared to the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. And, as I said, you can't tell if is that a 10-year drought or is that part of the climate change as well? I don't know. I don't think the mountain will become unclimbable, but the game as we know it and as we try to play it is obviously changing. And specifically, what's difficult about these drier conditions, the Lhotse face being icy, is far more dangerous for us than it is when it's frozen snow. There's just much more chance of rockfall or somebody dropping a carabiner and that sailing down water ice for thousands of feet. So from my perspective, that icy condition is more dangerous. As to climate change and people saying that the ice fall is more dangerous, I'm afraid the ice fall has always been dangerous, and it's nowhere else in the world would you look at up the middle of the Khumbu ice fall and say, hey, let's put a climbing route through the middle of that. So I'm afraid that's flawed logic to begin with, and I don't know that we can blame climate change for that one.
So, Phunuru, your first summit was in 2001,
yes,
and you've summited 9 times.
Yeah.
So how have you seen the mountain change over the last?
Change a lot, and I'm not saying like 50 and 90. So my first time in the summit.
Sorry, Jim.
So my first summit in Southside in 2003, and that time was especially in between South Summit to Hillary Steps. There are all the ice, snow ridge. So my last summit was in 2011, and right now in between South Summit to Hillary Step and all the rock. That means the climate changed a lot.
So it's all rock now.
There's all rock now.
Versus ice 10 years ago.
Yeah, between 10 years.
Okay. So Melissa, can you just tell us your thoughts about going through the ice fall? I mean, do you have concerns about it? You've been through it. You've got 5 summits, so you've been through the ice fall, 50 times, 40 times?
Yeah, I think one of the things about the ice fall is you can't think too much or you won't make it through there, Yeah. It's like Dave said, it's not a reasonable place to be. And yet it is one of the risks that you accept by climbing Everest on the south side in Nepal. And I have accepted that as a risk. And I try to manage the hazards that I can in the mountains and accept the ones that I can't. And, I couldn't say being in the ice fall lends any extra special, desire for me to be on Everest. That is not an enjoyable part of the climb. But it is part of the climb, and it is, how we navigate through that to get to the upper mountain. And I think climbing any mountain, it's slightly cliched to say it, but it's hugely about the process and the way that you get there, and that's part of it. And it's, I haven't spent as much time as many of these guys have on Everest, but the time I have spent, I feel like I'm learning a little bit about it, and it's an unpredictable teacher.
Any other thoughts about the ice fall or climate change from the panel? Great. Are you guys not playing my game the way I want you to?
We can't fight about anything yet.
All right, so in that case, Greg, I'll have to ask you a question directly. So you, with IMG, you guys have guided how many people have you guided on Everest?
Over 400 now.
400 people, and you've been involved with Everest since when?
2009.
2009. So how have you seen clients change in that time?
There are more of them. There are more companies out there who will accept clients, and I think what I'm noticing most is that the companies are probably not screening the clients as efficiently as they used to. That's what I see the most. As clients get higher, much easier for them to get in trouble, and it's simply because we haven't screened them. The companies out there need to do a pretty good job of screening the clients and talking with them, getting to know each other. And vice versa, the client needs to get to know the company and do their homework, who they're going to climb with.
Any other comments around the clientele on Everest?
Well, I think it's, that's a good point. There's more people willing to guide clients, but I also think the infrastructure that has been created on Everest doesn't just make it easy for clients to start the trip, because that is one process, but then, getting high and getting in trouble, we who are working on Everest are facilitating that. There's a certain amount of effort that you personally have to put forth to climb on Everest, and we're facilitating making that effort less and less and allowing people to get into a much more remote situation or a much harder to deal with situation when they do find themselves in trouble. And I've seen that absolutely in the last 7 years I've been there.
Do you think that the clients are becoming more dependent than ever on the Sherpas and the guides, or they're being less self-sufficient?
We've always been dependent on Sherpas. They're an integral part of climbing Mount Everest.
Do you think the clients are overly dependent?
I don't know if we can quantify dependent.
Okay.
Dependent is dependent. And, I think these guys are very important to the success of a client getting to the top of Mount Everest. Go ahead, Dave. Would you like to add something, Dave?
How could you tell? I mean, we're in danger of, we have good intentions here, but when we talk about the client, there is a huge range of the what defines a client on Mount Everest these days. And I'm afraid that when we're just throwing that tag around, that people have the worst vision of somebody who's totally dependent and hasn't done their homework, when the reality is some of the climbers that have paid for the services of others on Everest are very good climbers in their own right and are very well prepared for Everest, know its history, respect the cultures, and are coming to it on terms that everybody in this room would think are the appropriate. And sure, there's that range that's exposed when there's an accident there, and everybody points a finger and says, "Well, that person wasn't ready for Everest," and that's a client too. But let's remember, when we're referring to the clients, that encompasses a gigantic range in abilities. Just as pointing to a guide on Mount Everest, there's quite the range there as well. So it's not easy to label it so well with these terms.
This is MTNmeister, and you are listening to a panel discussion about Mount Everest that was hosted at the 2015 American Alpine Club benefit dinner. You just heard from Dave Hahn there, and if you'd like to hear more from Dave, we had him on for his own MTNmeister episode. He's number 84. You can listen on our website, MTNmeister.com, or on your smartphone through your favorite podcast app.
So keep the microphone, Dave. So another question is that in addition to talking about the clients, there's another whole aspect happening, especially over the last, let's say, 5 to 7 years, of the so-called stunts. I mean, there's people up there that have been married. There was the Dutch gentleman a few years ago that tried to climb it naked. There's jumps. There's wingsuit jumps or attempts. There's paragliding. What's your opinion of those types of stunts these days?
Well, I mean, I try not to be offended by them. I mean, some stunts, let's face it, are offensive or don't take into account that this is a sacred mountain for many people. But I try personally. I try to remember that what this person is doing, wingsuiting off of Everest. While that might not be my cup of tea,
Sure.
That it doesn't affect my mountain. It doesn't, it's not a threat to me, and it's different strokes for different folks. And as always, it's let the buyer beware. I mean, if the public gets excited about these and gets interested in climbing as a result, okay, then it's real. But sometimes we all kind of smirk because something's getting a lot of hype and there's no substance to it. But eventually, people see through that kind of thing, or if they don't, then they get what they deserve.
Ngima, from a Sherpa perspective, from a Sherpa point of view, what do you think of the stunts? Go ahead.
We're going to just take a minute here and translate, and Ngima's really nervous. Just relax.
Repeat the question, please. Sherwadang to Zaba Kayagonama, Chomudang Pertama Zeudang, to the Shurikin Nasam Limino Hobby.
Montagne translate material and to the ectom hopwin jealous the lungi direction training was now the lungi direction ye possible name on the public hey powdasa to the record gilagi ectom hopwin.
He said as long as the guy tips well, he's totally good to go with
it. And what he really said was.
So he mentioned that, especially in our cultures, so we believe in a God. So we respect in a God. That's why we trying to lot and we're not gonna do like this special thing in the mountains. So people try to climb the naked and people try to jump wherever you're there to do the merit on the top of the mountains. Our culture is like a little different, so that's why we trying to every time we're trying to stop all those things, and also we trying to talk about all the naval governments. So we're not gonna give the allowed and the future. So if these kind of many things they do on the mountain, and if the God is not happy. That's the problem. And every year got a big tragedy. That's the way he thinks.
Okay, thank you. All right, Garrett, this one's for you. So, the North Pole and the South Pole, those ridges, that's obviously 95% of the traffic and over the routes and the summits since the early 1900s. There are more routes on Everest. Uli mentioned, he's still here, talked about, he teased us with maybe talking about a new route that he's thinking about. But from a guided perspective, from a commercialized perspective, there are other routes. There's the West Ridge, there's the Pinnacles, there's the North Face. So what about that from a commercial perspective? What do you think the odds are that they'll ever be offered as a commercial special guide?
Well, I'd certainly like to see that, but in the near future, I don't think it's realistic to guide the other routes on Everest, the West Ridge, or Great Couloir, or any of these extremely steep and technical routes. It's certainly possible, but the logistics and manpower required to install the camps and the resources, fixed lines, it would be a monumental effort. So I think it's a very neat possibility, but I don't see that happening in the near future.
Greg, what about you? You think?
I think it comes down to what the client's acceptable level of risk is going to be. There's going to be people out there, like Dave said about the kind of client. With IMG, we expect everybody to arrive there with a certain set of skills and technical skills to climb the mountain. There are clients out there, there are climbers out there who have the ability to climb a more technically challenging route, probably on Everest. I mean, we see it on McKinley. There are different routes on McKinley, and that clients can sign up and go and climb. On Mount Everest, you know what? There's probably a market out there. We're not looking at that market, but I bet you there's some people out there who would explore this opportunity. K2, Garrett Madison.
We'll get to that. So, Melissa, there's been talk of the last couple of years about putting a ladder on the Hillary step.
Yes. Is that a question?
Good idea? Bad idea? What are your thoughts?
Honestly, it strikes me as kind of a weird conversation, to be totally honest with you. In my experience of what the Hillary step is like, it doesn't necessarily make sense to have a ladder there as a fixed thing. That doesn't, I don't know, it just seems like a very weird conversation. I saw it when it first came out in Nepal in the news and people talking about it, but I don't know exactly where it originated and who was coming up with that.
The ministry thought it would be a good idea to speed up the climbs and to cut out the bottlenecks.
Yeah, but I'm just not sure that would make sense. I just think looking at what the Hillary step is now and how it has been for the last couple of years, it just doesn't necessarily, that's not a sensible solution. So it just is sort of an out-of-place conversation, I actually think. At base camp and stuff, I haven't heard people talking about that, operators saying we should fix a ladder on the Hillary step. Am I missing those conversations?
This past year was the first year it came up, and there's as far as the ladder on the Hillary step goes, tons of opinions out there on it. And number one, there's a historic significance with the Hillary step, let's be honest. And I think that climbing the Hillary step is part of climbing Mount Everest. That's my opinion. As far as the bottlenecks and the efficiency and the speed at that elevation to get people up and down, there are so many things that we can do as climbers and guide services to mitigate the amount of people that we saw in, I don't know, pick a number, 2012. I think there's a wonderful photo out there somewhere. And so we saw this line of people in 2012 going up to the South Col. And why was that? It's often more than one thing that leads to that situation. And that particular year, we work every year very hard to fix the route as early as we can. And then after you saw in 2012, well, in 2013, there was an incredible effort amongst the base camp teams to talk about when and who and how many people they were going to send up the mountain and have that particular day. And in 2013, we fixed the mountain early. We did it also in 2011. We fixed the mountain quite early. 2012, we didn't, and then all of a sudden, everybody saw this window and took off running, so to speak. So I think there are a lot of things we can do to handle the number of people that are climbing Mount Everest long before we have to consider this Hillary step and a ladder situation.
Hey, Greg, 2 years ago, IMG put a a rappel station off the step, but only your guides used it. Nobody else used it. Do you think that's going to become a popular alternative? And I will ask you, Dave, the same question. Do you think you guys will be wrapping off the Hillary Step down climbing?
I wish you guys were sitting up here. I got 2 Sherpas kneeing me right now. Yes. Yeah, I think that alternate route, some people want to call it a stunt. I pushed for it, and I like it, and I believe it can help tremendously get people out of danger. And if there's somebody having a hard time on that Hillary step, and somebody's looking at their oxygen bottle, and they call down to me, and we talk about how much oxygen they have left, we might be able to move them a little more efficiently, a little quicker around that bottleneck on the Hillary step, and get those people out of trouble. We saw people in trouble in 2011, and maybe, who knows? Hard saying, not knowing. Hindsight's 20.
It's a pretty difficult rappel, though.
It's a pretty difficult rappel. You need to have the technical ability and the guidance to be able to do that. And I trust all my guys to be able to guide their client through a situation like that if need be.
Dave, what are your thoughts on wrapping the step?
I think Melissa hit on it at the start of this. The nature of the Hillary step, it doesn't really lend itself to a ladder solving the problem. And I think the reason that was probably suggested or that came up to begin with is there's a ladder on the second step on the north side, similar altitude. Well, why can't you just do the same thing and solve the Hillary step? But the second step, a sheer rock step, the ladder, you genuinely need the ladder there. The Hillary step already is a ladder of sorts, so the ladder is not solving a problem. What IMG and other teams combined to do to put that wrap route in, well, that's great, but yeah, it's pretty spicy for my money. Leaning back at that point and trusting that wrap route with people's crampons going over the top of the anchors and stuff. But yes, another outlet, another way down that obstacle is a good thing, another possible way around it. But I think this gets into one of your questions is going to be comparing the north side and the south side. And
Take it away. Go ahead. That's the next question. Let me set it up quickly. That there's a lot of debate right now after the disaster of last year that the south side is simply too dangerous to climb anymore. That in fact, one operator even went as far as saying no credible and responsible guide service will take clients on the south side ever again, and they've gone over to the north side. Take it away. I
agree. No credible and responsible person would, but I will be in 2 months. But I'm afraid the north side is not problem free, and particularly when it comes to the summit day, it's one of the reasons that the Hillary step sticks out on the south side. There are not too many choke points on that summit day. It's a difficult day. It's a bigger day from the south side and up more and steeper terrain, but it's more straightforward climbing in a sense. And the north side summit day comes down to a series of these little traverses and traps that are very hard to negotiate. Should something go wrong, or should you be on a crowd, that can make that day very difficult. If you will, it's a series of Hillary steps. Not insanely difficult, but complicated from our perspective as guides. Crowd control in that kind of terrain is difficult.
Henry, you summited both from the north and south, right?
Yes, sir.
So can you compare the two? Do you think one side is safer than the other?
I like to say the north side is little safer, so little less danger in avalanche, especially for our guide. Dave already mentioned that, and then the summit day, the little rigs for the guide. So I summited from north side in 2001 and 2003. So, and compare to the south side, and especially with guiding service or wherever we're guiding, to take the clients on the summit, from north side is a little more rigs for us.
Okay. So Garrett, you've guided more people to the summit of Everest than any other commercial guide. And there's how many now?
38.
38 people you've taken to the summit. So the question is, what advice do you have? There's a lot of people in the audience I know that are going to be going this year. Are there a couple of pieces of advice based upon your observation of mistakes that clients have made coming into the climb that you would advise people looking at Everest this year to try to focus on to avoid those mistakes?
Well, initially in your preparation, obviously you want to be trained and technically competent to go on an 8,000-meter peak expedition. One common mistake that pops up from time to time is overtraining. People want to do everything possible up until the last minute before departing to go to Nepal to maximize their chances, and I think sometimes climbers can push themselves too hard in their fitness training. So just sticking with your thought-out fitness program, and obviously having the prerequisite climbs under your belt from a technical standpoint, and also an expedition, 3-4 week commitment, knowing that you can be away from your friends and family and your comfort zone for that long, I think is very important. And then just following through on your strategy and your plan once you get to the mountain.
Anybody else? Advice for prospective climbers or observations of mistakes people have made in the past?
Dave? No.
Why do you look at me when he says mistakes?
You looked at me.
All right, we're going to move on.
Dot the I's and cross the T's at home before you go. Family, friends, all this Wi-Fi, all this cell phone, all this mass communication that we are having now, especially on the south side. Make sure you dot the I's and cross the T's with friends and family at home. That's the number one thing. I always say there's 3 pillars of climbing Everest. Physical, which Garrett talked about, the mental and the emotional. And, you get that leg over the Hillary step and you see the summit, you got to stop yourself from crying because you're almost there. But that emotional aspect of being away from friends and family at home, clear your mind of all that before you get over there. No news is good news, we say. Get up there, climb. They'll be ready for you when you get home.
So, Melissa, this one's for you. You recently did the first ascent in Nepal. And Nepal the government opened up over 100 mountains in the 6,000 to 7,000 meter range. Do you think that that's going to become an alternative to the trekking peaks like Mira and Island and Lobuche, or even Everest or Amanda Blanc? You had a great experience.
Yeah, I
Tell us about that.
Yeah, I had a fantastic experience climbing in the Mustang. We went to explore an area that really hadn't been explored by very many people and see if we could find these peaks. And my partners and I, we were actually looking for very moderate, fun climbing at around 6,000 meters that clients would enjoy, similar to Lobuche Peak and Island Peak. I think that, there isn't going to be a replacement, most certainly not for Everest. There is no way to replace what Everest is. And the peaks that are attractive as trekking peaks are so attractive because of where they're situated. You can have an experience and climb on Island Peak, a 6,000 meter peak, and just look at Everest just nearly touchable, and it's right there for you, and experience the magic of the Khumbu Valley. And the same is true for Lobuche Peak. And so I think you will continue to see traffic on both of those peaks just by where they're situated, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. And I think the truth is, for a lot of people, it's not necessarily about the interesting part of the climbing. It's about where they are and what they're doing, and I think that could be especially said for Everest. It's about being on Everest. It's not necessarily like Garrett speaking about opening other routes for climbing on Everest. It's really about the summit section of Everest that most people are interested in on that peak, not necessarily how they got there. And I think that's going to be true for these other peaks as well.
Hey, just to follow on what Melissa said, I think for people who want to climb the highest mountain in the world, nothing will replace Everest. But I do think it's great that the Nepalese government decided to open up 100 plus peaks in the 6,000 to 7,000 meter range in Nepal that were previously inaccessible or off limits to climbing. And it does take quite an effort to figure out the logistics and get into one of these peaks and make a first ascent. But I know there is some interest, and I hope to see that develop, especially this next year following on what Melissa and her team did recently. I know there are some groups planning to do some of these unclimbed peaks in the near future.
You are listening to MTNmeister, and I am the host of this podcast, Ben Shank. The moderator of this panel discussion, which you're currently enjoying, his name's Alan Arnette. Alan has been blogging about Mount Everest and the other big mountains around the world for many years, and Outside Magazine cited him as the most respected voice on Everest. We had Alan on for his own MTNmeister episode. It's episode number 99, called Climbing with a Purpose. And that purpose is raising funds and awareness for Alzheimer's. Check out Alan's episode to learn more about how climbing with a purpose has completely changed his perspective.
So I want to shift the conversation to talking about the Sherpa community, and after last year, it was such a tragedy that lost overall 19 Sherpa lives were lost last year, 16 in that one incident. So it brought into question some of the skills and some of the training, and a lot of us are familiar with the Khumbu Climbing Center and what a great work it does in training the Sherpas. And Greg, I'd like for you to maybe start off this conversation. I really would like to have everybody make a comment on this, about what skills do you think that the Sherpa community still needs in order to be able to safely guide clients on Everest, but that are perhaps lacking right now. And the context is that we're getting more and more clients. It used to be 100 people would summit in a season, and now you've got 500 people summiting. And the ratio has gone from one Westerner to two Sherpas, I'm sorry, the other way around, to two Sherpas for every one climber. So you've got more Sherpas. And so that demand is supply and demand. Is there enough trained Sherpas to really adequately meet this demand that's growing, especially coming from India and China and within Nepal as well as Western Europe, etc.?
That is a loaded question.
Good.
So much to talk about here. What is needed by the guys is know the terrain, and those Sherpa that we have over there that work for IMG, International Mountain Guides, they know the terrain. What they need to do to safely guide Everest. I love the Khumbu Climbing School and what Phunuru and Ngima do over there as instructors, and we encourage, not only here in the United States as guides, but over there to continue their education in the mountains, technically, in school with their language skills. What I think the Sherpas need to have the ability to do, and I think these guys sitting next to me here, as well as my whole team of Sherpa, which the past number of years I've had 70 Sherpa on the permit who are allowed to go above base camp. Okay? Now, those Sherpa are from young to old. I have guys who've summited Everest 18 times, some of them. And then I have Sherpa who this is their second, third, fourth peak, and they're working their way up, and they want to be Phunuru someday and have the English skills. And I think one of the big things for Sherpa that are coming up through the ranks and working with clients is to be able to have a voice. I've had some knockdown, drag-out matches verbally with Ngima sitting over here, and he's really shy, but he can talk, let me tell you. And I think it's incredibly important for these guys to have a voice and be able to come to myself as the expedition leader, our Sirdars. I have 3 Sirdars just within our team. Phunuru's my on-mountain Sirdar. He is my eyes. When I'm down at base camp, Phunuru and I are talking constantly, all day long. And they need to be able to say, hey, we don't like this. I don't want to take my client through that section. And we have talked about this at length, especially about the route, but in question about this tragedy last year, so many things went into that tragedy. It's very rarely one thing that goes wrong that culminates in something to that extent. And one of the things that we found out in picking up the pieces after that tragedy was, first and foremost, that ice fall had one ladder on it, and that ladder had been broken, and the guys were trying to fix it when that happened. The other thing that we noticed was when we were pulling backpacks out of the helicopter after we were cleaning up that mountain, we were noticing loads that were incredibly heavy. Okay, we have rules within our company, and they're actually rules with the Nepal Mountaineering Association of how many kilos a load is allowed to be. And we were pulling off backpacks from that helicopter that the guys were carrying that were 2 times the allowed weight limit for a guy to go up through there. So we're asking these guys to carry loads and move efficiently. I hasten to say that we want them to rush or go as fast as they can, because then maybe the guys aren't clipping or unclipping and using all the safety they need to do. We want them to clip and unclip and be safe, wear their helmets. We can go on and on. But having the Sherpas pick up their backpack and turn to their expedition leader and say, "You want me to carry all this up there? Hang on a second." And these guys, I hope, understand that they can come to me. The last argument Ngima and I had was about the Lhotse face and how dry it is to go back on Dave. And, we were up there and we were looking for the best way to go up the Lhotse face without having more rock and ice fall. And boy, I love the dialogue because these guys are good. Anything to add, Dave?
We'll get to load carriers in a second. Melissa, I want to ask you to talk a little bit about the Juniper Fund, but also in the context of skills required for the Sherpas to adequately support the clients up there. And do you think that the vast majority of the Sherpas have the appropriate climbing skills and the leadership skills and the language skills that are necessary to do it safely? And then if you would, just go ahead and comment about, go ahead and answer that if you would.
Sure. Yeah. So I think just like any place where you have a lot of people, there's going to be a huge range of types of people that you're going to work with. There's going to be people who are very experienced and people who are new in learning, people that have great grasp of language and leadership, and people that have a less good grasp of that. And that's true with the Sherpa culture just as it is with any culture. And you see that very much on Everest. There's a huge range of types of employees that are working on the mountain. And, like Greg is alluding to, I hope that the companies that are hiring all their staff, their Western guides and their local guides, are trying to do that responsibly and not just hiring bodies, but hiring people that are well suited to do the job, like any job. And, you see a mix of that because there is a lot of people there. And it's hard to tell, though, sometimes because, we all were new at one point and learning and starting, and that's true on Everest, too. People are learning and starting there on that mountain and working on that mountain, and you see a lot of Sherpa that are new.
So, with the Juniper Fund, you try to raise money to support the families of Sherpas who have been killed in their job of mountaineering as Sherpa guides. What's been the reaction to those families to the risk that the Sherpas take? You're probably uniquely qualified here to talk about that because of the Juniper Fund.
Yeah, so in 2012, David Morton and I founded the Juniper Fund to provide additional financial support to families after a death occurs of a local worker. A lot of those are Sherpa, and also to work within the government to try to increase the insurance standards and increase some of the benefits that families get when there is a tragedy that occurs. And this fall, we were able to go on September 9th and take funds to 21 families who were impacted by the loss of life of one of their family members. And that was hugely in generosity because of the American Alpine Club and all the support that they gave us, as well as other private donors and organizations. And there is nothing I've ever done in my entire life harder than sitting at a table with 13 widows who have lost their husbands or their brothers or children who've lost their fathers that year. And it's easy to sort of say at the start, I started out by saying, the ice fall is a risk that I accept. And I can't really accept that on the behalf of other people, especially when faced with the consequences, when you really see it. And, it is, people are going to climb Everest regardless and assume that risk, and there is a tremendous benefit to having work and fairly decent paying work. But, I think we have to function really responsibly and try to make sure that we are supporting families long term if there is a tragedy or an accident, and try to increase the standards from the government. And it's an incredibly complicated process and really hard to do, but I think it's really important.
And life insurance and medical has been increased for this year.
It has been increased, and that, that's one thing that's kind of potentially a good thing. Little increases are good, but also, we want a much greater increase. We're hoping for a much bigger increase, a much bigger show of support, and so maybe that's harder now because the government can say, we just did increase it. What do you want more? So it's hard because we really want the standard to be adequate, if not generous.
You just heard from Melissa Arnot, who is also a MTNmeister. She is featured in episode number 74. It's called Exploring Mountain and Mind. If you'd like to find out why a person 30 years old has already summited Everest 5 times, or if you just want to know why she tells people she works for Starbucks, you should listen to her episode.
So one of the issues is with all the load carrying that we asked for the Sherpa community to do on behalf of people like me, that I can't do it for myself, that you have a lot of gear that has to get ferried into the Western Cumb up to Camp, primarily Advanced Base Camp, Camp 2 on the south side. So I've seen a lot of what I would term luxuries at Advanced Base Camp at Camp 2. Huge tents. I mean, tables and chairs, individual tents for some people instead of teaming up. When you compare that to McKinley, where, you eat out of Tupperware and, you have 4 to a tent, and in many cases you spend more time at a higher altitude on other mountains than you do on Everest above base camp. What's the need for all of that shit up there at Camp 2? I mean, why don't we just cut it? And I know there's a lot of talk about using helicopters to get up there, and in fact, a lot of you guys already have gear stashed or cached from last year that you couldn't get down. But the Nepalese have not been able to, or will not, allow helicopters to go up there. And frankly, all it's going to take are a couple of those B-3 helicopters to crash, and the insurance companies are going to say, we're not going to foot the bill anymore. So honestly, using helicopters is probably not a good solution. So back to my question. Greg's going to disagree with me. I'd love it. But I'm going to hit up Garrett first, because he's wiggling the most. So why do you have to have all these so-called luxuries at Advanced Base Camp?
I think as commercial operators struggle to compete against one another, one of the incentives they can offer to their potential climbers are these luxuries at Camp 2, like big dining tents with tables and chairs, propane heaters, sometimes carpets. So that's definitely approaching over the top, and I hope that we do see a decrease in that amount of luxuries. If we had helicopters, it would make it easier to ferry those loads up. But what I would like to see happen is for the government of Nepal to allow teams to store equipment at Camp 2 that they use year after year, so that it doesn't have to be ferried up and down through the icefall. However, I wouldn't mind also, as you said, seeing it revert to a more Denali-style climb where climbers are eating out of their Tupperware and living in their small personal tent and not having these big, luxurious amenities.
Dave, what's your comments on this? I mean, you've been around a long time. You've seen this luxury creep as it goes up the mountain.
Yeah, I mean, it's ingrained in Everest climbing. It's a make work project, an Everest trip, and the loads that go to Advanced Base Camp are part of that. But to say, as I did, that the Khumbu Icefall is a ridiculously dangerous climb, yeah, that's fine, but to leave it at that and to shrug your shoulders and say, well, then we can't do anything about it, and then to march right through or to send your climbers right through, I think that's irresponsible as well. How we put that route through the icefall, how it's maintained, and back to your last question about the level of competence and training and equipment that the climbers you're sending through it have, that's all relevant. And, if we're going to send people through the icefall, employees, in my book, they should be equipped the way we would be equipped anywhere else in the world for similar work. They should have avalanche beacons. They should have radios so that we don't end up with traffic jams like the tragic one this last year. And they should be part of teams that are communicating well enough that they know where all their team members are. And, instead of those packs jammed to the gills with just the loads being carried, like any other climbers in the rest of the world in a dangerous place, they should be carrying rescue gear. Every so many Sherpas should have an ice axe and a rescue rope. Some of these things that are a minimum anywhere else, those would be useful tools in dangerous terrain like that. I don't want helicopters doing the climb for me. I don't want helicopters ferrying loads. If we're going to climb Mount Everest from the south side, as bad as it is, we're going to deal with the Khumbu icefall. But how we deal with that, I think there's a great range, and I think it's smart to focus on what you would do in the Khumbu icefall to make yourself safer, your climbers safer, your Sherpa and Nepali staff safer.
So one of the things you guys are talking about is a common theme that I'm hearing is that there's this creep going on of competition amongst mainly the Western guides. And there's about 10 companies around the globe that have really made their mark on Everest over the last, say, 20 years. But there's a whole new breed of companies that are emerging now in Nepal. We've had the traditional ones like Asian Trekking, but new ones like Seven Summits Trek, who in 2012 had 98 clients, and they charged reportedly around $20,000 per person. And most of those clients came from India, and some from China, and some from Nepal. This panel, you guys, Greg, you traditionally were at around 40,000 for a Sherpa guided climb. Now you're up to 45. Garrett, you were with AAI for a long time, which was 65,000. Mr. Hahn here he'll take you up for the mountain for about the same amount of price. So you guys are at the high end, and you've got the local companies coming in at the low end. How are you going to compete? Garrett, I'll launch it to you first.
Yeah, I think it could be a race to the bottom, but it won't be because what the foreign companies, American, European, New Zealand-based companies will continue doing is maintaining a very high standard on the mountain. And part of that means you have foreign leadership. You have guys like Dave Hahn or Melissa or Greg up on the mountain making decisions. And it costs a lot of money to bring somebody like Dave Hahn to Everest. You have to pay for his permit and expenses and a small salary. So you
get paid.
So the big difference is with a company like Seven Summits Treks, they're not bringing any foreign people to the mountain as guides or team leaders. It's a solely Nepalese-owned and operated organization. So they're able to keep their costs way, way down, and also by sheer scale and numbers, they're able to pack a ton of people into their base camp and bring down their overall costs that they need to charge for logistics and facilities. So for a cost-conscious climber, it's absolutely something to look at to save $30,000, $40,000 on your Everest climb. But you also have to look at the statistics, and in the end, we always see the fatalities are high from these companies that lack the foreign oversight.
I want to talk. Your question was, how are we going to compete? I'm absolutely not going to compete. I don't want to compete with anybody on Everest. I don't want to run a business on Everest. I want to guide. And to do that, I have to learn to deal with other people on the mountain and work with those other organizations. But as far as stealing away their business, I don't want it. I don't want somebody who wants to save money on Everest. I don't want somebody who wants to save time on Everest. I want somebody who is so rabidly enthralled with the idea of climbing Mount Everest that they can barely be held back. But I don't want to take somebody to Everest that wants to do it on the cheap. There are other people that will. That's great. There's too much at stake for me.
Competition? Anybody else?
I liked how passionate Dave was just there. That was awesome.
Not a competitor.
That was awesome.
So Gary, you brought up the death rates, and every year people die on Everest. Clients and sometimes guides and sometimes Sherpas, often Sherpas. But there's really no regulations that dictate who can guide on Everest. Anybody can put up a website and claim that they're an Everest guide. But also there's a lack of transparency that with guide services that don't report deaths that happen on Everest. And often that's attributed back to the family, saying, well, the family said, I don't want my loved one to be brought up in the press for dying. But isn't there a way of meeting the confidentiality and the respect and still being transparent? And I don't think it's going to happen necessarily with some of the local guides and some of the ones that are competing on price. But isn't it time for the Western companies to take leadership and be more transparent about deaths? Because most of the time when the deaths happen, it's not your fault. It was something that happened. It was a latent defect in a person. They had an aneurysm. It was they fell in a crevasse. It was something that was way beyond your control, and how you handled it could actually be something that would be good. So why is there not more transparency amongst the Western guide services, and I include American, European, New Zealand, Australian in that, around deaths on Everest?
That's a great question, Alan. Fortunately, I haven't had to deal with a climbing client on my team that's died in Nepal or on Everest. We did lose 3 Sherpas from our team that were buried in the icefall accident in the spring. But I think initially it's out of respect to the family and wanting to let the family communicate with their relatives and loved ones about the loss of their family member on the mountain, and then giving permission to the operator, the American or European, New Zealand-owned guide service, to convey that information. But you're right, there isn't transparency out there. You can't easily find statistics related to fatalities with Western guide companies.
Yeah, if you Google some famous guide companies and the word death or dead or injury, often you come up with nothing, which tells me that website's been doctored to remove that so that they maintain their good image.
You looking at me?
You've got a good image.
Luckily, I haven't had personal experience with this, but we all know there's a very fine line between announcing injuries or death on your team and sensationalizing it and benefiting from the media storm that comes with that kind of publicity. So I think we'd all be in horror to see that kind of thing used incorrectly, to promote the next year's climb. So that it's what you're talking about isn't just in climbing, but in any adventure travel. That's a very sensitive subject. And again, I think for the way you're asking the question, I think you're asking it in terms of how can somebody tell with the company that they're signing up with, have they had injuries or deaths in the past? And as always, let the buyer beware. I don't think it's strange that you tap into the guide service and the front page doesn't say, we've hurt this many people. But it's not impossible to dig around and understand the reputation and the experience level of the people that you're looking to sign up with.
I agree with Dave there, and it goes back to very important that the client, as climbers, they need to do their homework. And if you call, you can call IMG and talk to Simonson or myself, and we're an open book and very transparent about that. And as far as a death goes, our policy within IMG, and I think probably amongst most of the people up here, is our clients appreciate that we're not plastering all over the internet or our blog that somebody passed away. Not only if it were to happen with our own company, but another company. You're sitting next to some friends and family in the room. Wouldn't it be the worst possible thing in the world to have to read about how Sally is dog meat on the climb today and there's no way she's going to make it? Or so-and-so from another team died a couple of days ago. That would be the worst possible way I think anybody would want to find out about that. And so all these blogs, we're not news sources, but as you're doing your homework and you're studying about what guide service you want to climb with, I would think this goes in that list of questions that you would want to ask. And hopefully that guide service talks about the different situations they've had on the mountain.
So given all the deaths last year, and as we approach now 2 months into 2015, what are you going to do differently this year? What lessons were learned from last year?
That we should put the icefall route back in the middle with 2 lines in the bottleneck spots.
Okay. Other lessons?
I think what Greg just said, 2 lines, I believe he's referring to an up line and a down line.
Like in the icefall.
Yeah, like we have on sections of the Lhotse face and even the Summit Ridge, for instance, the Hillary Step in 2013, an up line and a rappel line. That way, hopefully there wouldn't be congestion in the icefall in areas that are exposed to a significant objective hazard, mainly overhanging ice.
I think more importantly than the objective hazard of the icefall, which will continue to always be hazardous, and we watch avalanches come through there, and sometimes nobody's hit and sometimes a lot of people are. I think, learning from last year how we support the local workers who are working there and trying to do a better job of actually being supportive and responsible members of the climbing community in Nepal when we are there.
Yeah, the SPCC is in charge of a group called the Icefall Doctors, and I think all of us are probably in agreement. I put words in everybody's mouth that, we need to continue to train these Icefall Doctors. And I'll throw out a number off the top of my head. Last year, the SPC collected $150,000 that was supposed to be put towards equipment and training for the Icefall Doctors. Ladders, ropes, screws, training, all the gear Icefall Doctors need to go there. And the SPCC is encouraged to save as much money as they can from that so that they can put it towards other things in the off season. Now these other things are great. Some recycling plants here and there, that'd be fantastic. In the Khumbu Valley, which we've seen great improvements with recycling. But I believe more of that money that's going from the climbers towards the SPCC should go towards the Icefall Doctors, whether there are more of them so they can be there a little bit more around the clock, the training of the Icefall Doctors, the route, the past few years, and I've been advocating for years to see if we can move a little bit further away from that shoulder up near the top. Maybe we can keep a line, maybe a down line over there because it is quicker, it's more efficient for coming back down. But staying away from that shoulder where all that stuff can rip off, and that'll take a little more manpower, that'll take a little bit more education and ladders and rope, but possibly going back towards the middle might get us out of the way of that shoulder. Dave?
You bet. I agree. If we can go to the middle, I mean, the center of the glacier has been shattered for the last 5 years or so, and that's why the Icefall Doctors have put the route on that shoulder, and the Sherpas tend to like it better because it is faster. But yes, it has that potential for the bigger disaster, whereas going up the center, there's always still the potential for one or two or three people getting killed when something collapses, but not as much the catastrophe. So yeah, my hope is that we can have a little more influence. The SPCC is essentially the national park. But yeah, it's been this unfortunate situation that the Sherpas that they hire to work the icefall route with our money are some of the most poorly equipped guys on the mountain with poor benefits and not much structure to it and undermanned. So I was encouraged to hear Phunuru was just involved with training with some of the icefall doctors and said they had doubled that staff to 10, but I'd want to see more icefall doctors. They have a dangerous job, and it's a thankless job largely. I'd like to see them paid better. I'd like to see more of them employed. If we're going to have a route through the Khumbu Icefall, then the least we could do is make it a better route through the icefall. And I think that would be a good place to start. But a difficult thing for us, in order to have some influence, you've got to go over there a little bit earlier in the season when that route is getting put in. And none of us really wants to be there in mid-March when it's kind of cold and wet at base camp, and to take that charge and to be involved on a day-to-day basis at that time of the year. But that might be what's required to actually have some influence. We've all got other things to do at that point of the year, but that might be what it takes.
So I've got one more question because I'm running out of time, but then I also want to, if there's a follow-on question or something that somebody's just dying to ask, I'd love to take a page out of Jen's book and open it up to the audience. So my last question is around K2. And so in the last couple of years, actually 2012 and 14, there were close to, around 40, 45 people summited K2. In a typical year on K2, it's only a handful of people that summited. I was lucky enough to summit last summer with Garrett, and we had a small team of 3 Americans that summited along with 3 wonderful Sherpas. So Garrett, do you think that K2 has become the new Everest?
Well, it's always be a different mountain. Just getting to K2 is logistically much more difficult in Pakistan, especially for an American. Much longer trek to base camp, completely unsupported without any of the villages or human settlements along the way. And the mountain traditionally has been more difficult and dangerous, both from objective hazard and also due to bad weather. But I think for climbers who are looking for a big challenge after Everest, it certainly presents an interesting objective.
Dave, would you ever guide K2?
To be fair, I haven't been asked. I think K2 is a mountain that many people, not all obviously, but many people choose to go to it to prove that they don't need guiding. And the more it gets climbed, the less its difficulties will be. It will become established just the same way the south side of Everest and then the north side, that once things became better traveled, once things became known, it became easier to do it year to year. And sure, the same thing could go on K2. But yeah, as Garrett said, the access is a little different. And yeah, to be honest, my services aren't in great demand there. And that's okay with me. There's plenty of mountains that I wouldn't aspire to guide or even climb, but I wouldn't mind seeing it someday.
Greg, would IMG ever guide K2?
Not right now. Not right now. There's a lot of there are a lot of risks that I don't see acceptable from going into the country. Pakistan, we don't need to talk about that, but I think the risk, and I second Dave, a lot of climbers go there to prove they don't need guidance. So not right now, the risk.
So a question from the audience.
Oh, man.
Sure. We touched on in the previous talk the idea of should there be control introduced in some form with regards to maybe the numbers, or a more laissez-faire approach where it's going to reach its own natural limitations. I'm sure from a commercial standpoint it's a double-edged sword. There's probably pros and cons to having some kind of imposed controls as opposed to just a natural, finding its limits. What are your thoughts about introducing some kind of control on particularly the numbers, I guess?
So in the back, the question is basically, can you control Everest with the number of climbers, and should there be quotas put onto it, for example?
Who would, I guess the question I asked back was who would control it? The government of Nepal?
Presumably, but...
Yeah, with the government of Nepal, they can't even give their people electricity and clean water right now. So... So to ask the government to do anything, and that's, we can get into some more questions probably that I'm sure the hands are going to go up over, but we've got enough battles right now, and I think the teams at base camp can do a pretty good job of handling the numbers.
Melissa?
Yeah, it's interesting if you actually look at the actual numbers. There was more climbers in 2008 than 2009, 10, and 11. The numbers continuously decreased, then slowly started to increase again, and then dropped again. So we look at pictures that really say, oh, there's a lot of climbers there. There's a lot of climbers climbing on the same day. But I don't think it's necessarily like the total number management that's right now the issue. And I think, it is important to look at how we're climbing, trying to climb responsibly, ensnaring as few other people and resources in our summits as we can, and look at that a little more responsibly than just the set number.
So more of the how rather than the sheer.
Yeah, and I've been...
Like Denali does.
Yeah, and I've been a huge advocate of saying we who have summited Everest shouldn't really have the right to say you can't. Yeah. It's kind of a hard thing to...
Done that, yeah. Okay, right.
Greg mentioned earlier about really talking to your clients to find out what kind of experience they have. And why can't there be a rule that requires a certain level of experience, i.e. having climbed other 8,000 meter peaks before going to Everest? Because before I ever went to Everest, I didn't feel as though I belonged there until I'd had the experience on other high peaks. And when I was on Everest, I met a guy from California who had only climbed Mount Whitney before going to Everest, and felt that he was qualified to be there. And so why not create a rule that says, you need to have a certain level of high altitude experience, having climbed Cho-Oyu or some other peaks before you get yourself on that.
So why not require something more than Aconcagua and Denali to be qualified to climb Everest? Dave?
Well, I think, nobody would argue that more experience before going to Everest is a bad thing. But, we can decide all in favor of more experience. We can make a decision here on Lexington Avenue in Manhattan. But, as you mentioned, a lot of the climbers now are coming from the new affluence in China and India. We can set our standard, but that won't, unfortunately, that won't change the reality and the coming reality on Everest. I work for a guide service, Rainier Mountaineering. We work in the national parks in America on Mount Rainier and Denali, and we're pretty heavily regulated. I'd say very heavily regulated. I don't want that on Mount Everest. I would like a little bit more regulation there, but as Garrett said and others have said, who's going to do it? And unfortunately, the government of Nepal is not who very many of us look to for help these days.
Greg, did you want to add?
I think we're okay.
Okay, good. Yeah, please.
Back to economics, and I'd like Phunuru to answer this question, if you would. With the climate change increasing risks and increased expectations on you and the Sherpas, language requirements, so many other educational requirements, How has your compensation been changed in recent years? And then if one of the guide services would answer that too.
So the question is, are the Sherpas getting paid more now in relation to the increased workload and the risk?
Yeah. So especially I work in IMG, so almost 14 years ago. So first time I work in IMG, so I'm just beginner Sherpas. So right now I'm climbing shoulder in IMG, so I always talk to the Greg. So we need to be good paying for the Sherpas, and always we're looking for the good skilled Sherpas. So the climate change talking about like this, and so last year one of my Sherpas, and he climbed Everest more than 18 times, 19 times, and he this year also I talked to him, so he mentioned that I'm not going to climb to Everest, and I asked to him, so why? So he says like between like 10 and 12 years the climate change is a lot, so especially in let's say in the south and South Summit and asphalt. He talk about like that, and that's where in the climate change a lot, and most of the old climber now very nervous.
So to the question of are the commercial operators paying Sherpas more today than they were 3 or 4 years ago?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Last question. Yes, right here.
My question is: do you see Nepal and China ever approaching the ecological standards that are on Denali in terms of preservation and waste removal?
The question was about getting environmental and ecological concerns in that part of the world, Tibet, Nepal, up to our standards and the care we do take in our national parks. And sure, that would be the hope, and I think great progress has been made that way on Mount Everest. More progress needs to be made. For sure, we have an impact by going there. As much as we talk about trying to clean up the mountain and actually cleaning up the mountain, bringing down tons of waste, the fact that we go to a fragile part of this planet means that we have an impact by being there. And so more needs to be done. But probably your best hope for that kind of progress that you're seeking is a better economy in Nepal, better economy in Tibet. You know, more affluent people tend to have more time to be concerned with their environment, more opportunity to take care of their environment.
All right. Well, thanks a lot to the panel, and thanks to all of you.
I hope you enjoyed this panel discussion about the current state of Mount Everest. Again, this was hosted at the 2015 American Alpine Club Benefit Dinner Weekend. If you would like to hear the other two presentations that went on that day, one was an interview with Uli Steck and Sir Chris Bonington, the other a presentation from American professional rock climber Sasha DeJulian. You can check out both of those on our website, MTNmeister.com, or on your favorite podcast app. We also have a whole library of over 100 episodes full of interviews like these. I encourage you to check those